Welcome to another episode of the Art Astro podcast. Today we have with us Fien de Block. Welcome. She is a guest professor and researcher at the University of Gent, who recently completed her PhD in 2020, which is entitled Redrawing the Lines, the Science of the Stars in the Late 15th Century Sultanate of Cairo, and addresses the practices of astrology, as the title indicates, in the 15th century Egypt. So, welcome, Fien.
Thank you very
Nice to have
much.
you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been a while since we contact first to talk. You were still completing your research, or you had recently completed your research, I think, when we first contact, but then circumstances led to the postponement of this talk.
Indeed.
So let us know a little bit about your research and how did you get into the history of astrology and doing this great research.
So I study astrology in the late 15th century Mamluk Sultanate, or the Sultanate of Cairo, as it recently came to be called in academic literature, so in Egypt and Syria. And I got interested in astrology because for my master's thesis, I studied Ibn Shatir, so the Syrian scholar from the 14th century who wrote Zij al-Jadid, so a collection of tables that were used by timekeepers, by Islamic timekeepers or muwakkits. And in his work, he treats a lot of topics that are today considered to be astrology. For example, projection of rays, takwim or ephemerides, conjunctions, kiranet. And I got interested in that topic because in secondary literature, muwakkits or Islamic timekeepers were not generally associated with astrology. They worked in Islamic institutions, in madrasas or in mosques, and they were somehow expected to be against astrology. But apart from like a couple of references in literature to these practices, I didn't really find anything about it. So I got interested in the reason why that there was no research about that, and what the importance of astrology might have been. So I started researching that, but then I found out that, a lot of colleagues, later colleagues of Ibn Shatir, Islamic timekeepers, practiced astrology, but didn't really refer to it as ilm ahkam nujum, the Arabic term that we usually use to translate astrology. So in the sources and even in classifications in libraries, it's often classified as timekeeping. And then on the one hand, that was on one of my findings, but then on the other hand, I also found texts that were actually referred to as ilm ahkam nujum, but the difference between the texts written by those timekeepers and these texts that were referred to as ilm ahkam nujum was not really astrology or astronomy as we would expect it, or as it was generally expected to be, but rather the sort of the metaphysical framework from which these authors were working, and also the context in which they were working. So that's a bit, the short
a summary.
the short summary of how I
Okay, okay. Because so you have, if I understood correctly, you have these figures which are timekeepers, and probably so they regulate the calendar, religious, all the religious festivities and structures, and of course you will have tables for that, and then you find in those tables certain references to astrology that lead you to practice of astrology.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
So these references, on the one hand, for example, to conjunctions or ephemerides, but also on the other hand, and that's something that I would like to study more in the future, because I don't really have a conclusion for, or yeah, but I don't really know what the reason behind that is. But when you look at the circulation of those tables in the late 15th century, or at least for one specific collection of Taqwim tables that are linked to the Muwakkids of Ibn al-Majdi, who lived in the early 15th century. When you look at the circulation of those tables, you see that they are often combined with, ilm ahkam al-nujum, so astrology manuscripts in composite volumes. But the difficulty there is that I don't know when these manuscripts are combined. I don't know if they were used together in the 15th century already, or if they were combined in a later period, for example, during the Ottoman period. So that's another thing about those timekeeper sources, because for that part of my research, that part of my PhD research, I mostly looked at the circulation of those sources, because of course these tables, I mean, not all of it would be considered astrology today, but astrologers needed them to make their calculations. So I was interested in how did they circulate, who used them, and I mostly tried to look into the colophons and the marginal notes to get an idea about that.
Yeah.
But up until now, I still think it's very interesting and very relevant to look at the overlap between the people who wrote those tables and the people who actually cast the horoscopes, for example. But I haven't been able to find, what I would call the smoking gun.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a part of sometimes not a problem, but a challenge in this type of research is we're dealing with periods and sometimes cultures where this separation between what is astronomy and what is astrology, it's not that clear. And the fact that in Arabic we have a whole name for the whole practice, it's in itself very clear on that, I think. And I think it has been a challenge to separate, you have tables, but for example, you have tables. I found this on my side because I've focused. You're in European astrology, of course. I'm not at all versed in Arabic to study the materials or the periods and locations you're studying, but I do find similarities in the sense that if you have tables, for example, with planetary motions, certainly that that's not for timekeeping because, or the conjunction that you mentioned, they're notable heavenly events, but they are irrelevant for the calendar. For the calendar, you need basically the moon and the sun to do and especially with the Arabic calendar, which follows a lot the solar lunar cycle. That's what you need, and then you find this extra information that they are keeping, and it is being preserved and continued, but it's beyond what they're supposed to be doing, and then it's very difficult to separate. So is this an astrological thing? It's an astronomical thing? And again, the term itself, it's completely out of its own time. It's completely And then
Yes,
it's very
indeed.
difficult to transmit. Did you find that difficult, to then explain what you're seeing in modern terms?
Yes. Yeah, that's actually why I chose to talk about the signs of the stars in the title of my dissertation, because for both of, I had the impression that in the sources that I looked at, for both of these collections, the terminology of ilm nujum, so the signs of the stars, was used, and the difference between the tables that were considered the signs of timekeeping, and then the texts and the horoscopes that were considered ilm ahkam nujum, so the signs of the regulations of the stars, in at least in the collections that I looked at, was not the difference between what we would refer to as astrology and astronomy, but a difference between the metaphysical framework, and also the groups of people that were involved. The signs of the regulations of the stars was very much more elitist than timekeeping, for example. And I think that's very important, because I think in a way it is because these terms, or the translation of these terms, has been taken for granted. That is the fact that has led to the idea that there was no astrology, or that astrology was not that much practiced in the Sultanate of Cairo, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the idea that Islamic timekeepers worked in religious institutions and therefore didn't practice astrology is also very much a modern idea of Orthodox religion not being not being positive towards astrology, or in a wider sense towards magic, whereas that dichotomy is not really there in the sources. You have other dichotomies and other tensions, but by just assuming the modern categories, as much science and religion as a third category of the occult or magic, it really hides a lot of what was going on when it comes to astrology or the signs of the stars, or scholarly activity in general in the Sultanate of Cairo, in my according to my findings up until now.
I completely understand. It's we're putting not only modern categories. It's sort of modern preconception. We have an idea that is based on our own time and experience and cultural experience. And then we try to project it, and that's not what we're going to find. And
yes,
we really need as historians and researchers in history to really make sure that we ourselves sometimes are not prejudging something, with a different attitude. Okay.
yes, indeed. And on the other hand, I don't think we can entirely do away with those categories, those modern categories, because we, of course, our thinking is very much influenced, and not only our thinking, but also our catalogs, or when we go to manuscript libraries, the catalogs are very much influenced and ordered according to those modern categories. And I think, but I think I like to look at the actors categories in my texts, to see the difference, to sort of confront my own presumptions, or my own categories, with those of the historical actors. And of course, you can't entirely know how they used it. I mean, you can try to get an idea based on the sources and the marginal notes, but often the difference between how we think about it and how they're used in the text is already surprising and very interesting to take a look.
Yeah, true. In the course of my research, and as you were saying toward yours as well, we go having a thought in mind, you know, okay, this is going to be the categories I'm going to use, and then suddenly the sources are just turn things around.
Mm-hmm.
We are forced to rethink our own
Yeah.
approaches to the research. Yeah. Mm. And I'm curious. So you're studying, what you're studying is a very specific set of sources and documents and circumstances. And there were a couple of things I would like to ask you. So you were saying earlier that there is a separation in terms of elite from those who are who are taking care of calendar calculation and calendar keeping, timekeeping, and those who are practicing astrology. And I had discussions with other scholars on this. So you're not learning the science of the stars or the practice of astrology in this case in the same context as you're going to learn the timekeeping. I assume that has a lot to do with it. So
Yeah.
did you find any reference in how are these practitioners learning this kind of information, where it comes from?
I didn't, well, for the timekeeping part, there are a lot of references of people studying timekeeping in the religious institutions where also timekeepers worked. So the madrasas, or so schools or mosques or Sufi lodges sometimes also. When it comes to ilm ahkam an-nujum, so the science of the regulations of the stars, or what is often translated as astrology, I haven't come across any specific references, but I have my hypothesis would be that it's more of a person-to-person. Well, of course, education also in madrasa was very much a personal, the personal aspect was very important also there, but I haven't come across any ilm ahkam an-nujum references in madrasas yet. So I think it's even more based on a personal link. For example, for it, two of the authors that I've studied for the second collection of my PhD dissertation, so the texts on astrology and were the texts that contained horoscopes, they seem to have actually met and seem to have known each other, and I think one of them is a student of the other. I'm not entirely sure yet, but yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So,
So we have a sort of master apprenticeship relationship where you're teaching.
yes, indeed.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting because we do have hints of sort of the same kind of thing happening here as well. So in the European context, because we do have the universities, which are again like the madrasas in the Islamic world, official centers where learning is taking place, although of a different category, of course. But it's not completely clear when regards to the transmission of astrology specific, not so much astronomy, but astrology specifically. It's very unclear how exactly they're learning, because sometimes you do not have a reference to a class on astrology specific or something that you can identify as to what we today, again, the categories again, to what we today call astrology. So yeah, so I think probably it is it's the same thing is happening, even in different cultural
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, but then on the other hand, the calculation, for example, of conjunctions or ephemerides was very much part of ilm al-miqat, or the science of timekeeping, and I think that that is actually mentioned when it comes to madrasas or institutional education. So that is one thing. And then on the other hand, for the Sultanate of Cairo, even when there were a lot of madrasas, religious institutions where education took place, still the main or the most important aspect or part of that education was the teacher and the students relation. So I'm not familiar with the situation in Europe at that time. I don't know enough about it, but for the situation in the Sultanate of Cairo, I think although there were institutions, the authority did not come from the institution in the first place, but from the people working there. It was more sort of the accommodation than the place of authority. So in that sense, yeah, the boundary is a bit less strict, I guess.
Yeah.
But I haven't come across anything on the signs of the regulations of the stars, ilm ahkam an-nujum, when it comes to education up until now.
Yeah, I think that's a huge blank spot in the historiography of the history of astrology. So where we don't really know, we see all this transmission, we see this kind of testimony that you studied, you know, that gives us a lot of hints, hypotheses, you know, possibilities that we can extract from that information. But in terms to education, how are these people, you know, that become, you know, court astrologers or being astrologers, you know, more popular to more popular level? How are they learning their craft? Are they learning from the same place? And of course, if I understood correctly, what you told, the madrasas and this kind of institution is more heterogeneous because it really depends on the people who are there. And I think the same thing would happen even in a European university context. It depends on who the teachers are and what they can teach, but still it's less regulated than it would. So it's quite interesting. So the same situation in your context might not be the same in another country or in another kingdom. So there might be some differences.
Yes, indeed. And something that I'm researching now regarding to that is one of the authors working on ilm ahkam an-nujum, so the signs and regulations of the stars, I found a couple of multi-text manuscripts from him, so manuscripts that contain different texts, but all from his hand and all written somehow in the same period, or somewhat in the same period. And there he combines older texts, so handbooks on astrology, often handbooks by famous scholars like Ibn Abi Rijal, or there's also a pseudo Ptolemy manuscript or text. Very well-known texts from earlier period he combines with his own calculations or horoscopes for events happening in his own time. So there also my hypothesis would be that this is somehow an artifact of him learning how to apply these texts that were circulating to the things that he wanted to know, the things that he wanted to do. And the interesting thing there is that the entire manuscript up until today only contains his text. So there, I think that these texts were actually already combined in the period itself, and can show us a lot about what people like this scholar were reading and how they were learning things. But it's still very much research in progress.
Okay, the one thing that I'm very interested in my own research is exactly what you were saying, you know, the practice. So not just the text and the transmission, and it's interesting what you're saying, that he is taking his own sources, combining them for his own practice, but also what have you found exactly on practice? You know, what kind of practice? Horoscopes, but to what end? You know, per people, events?
Yes. Up until now, I've mostly found horoscopes and then short texts on these horoscopes that were about events during battles. So battles in the Syrian Anatolian frontier zone of the Sultanate of Cairo. So, for example, a battle between the Ottoman army and the army of Cairo, a battle between one of the for example, also a horoscope that was compiled for an Akuyunlu envoy that was on his way to Cairo, because I talked about one of the authors practicing astrology. His name is actually Ibn Timur Bey, and the scholar who I think was his teacher is called Yusuf ibn Kurkumaz al-Hamzawi, and he lived in Aleppo during most of his life, and he seems to have compiled those horoscopes there. So the Akuyunlu messenger traveled through Aleppo, and the horoscope was compiled there. So most of them are in a military or war context.
Yeah, in this, for example, in this case of the messenger, what is it about? It's about its travel. If he's going to accomplish his mission, is
no,
that
he's actually the Akuyunlu messenger is traveling to Cairo to the Sultan to suggest that the Akuyunlu Sultan at that moment wants to sort of I can't think of the exact term wants to lead the conversation or the peace conversation between the Sultanate of Cairo and the Ottomans. But and on his way he wants to know what the situation is on the battlefield between the Ottoman army and the army of Cairo, to get an idea of what he should expect, I guess, when he comes to Cairo. Yeah.
Okay.
And the interesting part there is, so I said that what I think the difference between the astrology related to timekeeping and the astrology in this context is the metaphysical framework. And the interesting thing in those manuscripts is that astrology is often linked to the signs of names and letters. For example, in one of these horoscopes, a horoscope on a certain battle, the author states that the Mamluk army won because of the name of the commander, and then the signs of the stars, or astrology in this sense, seems to be a means to get to know more about the world that is essentially lettrist. So that's something that at least I have never found in any timekeeping related sources.
And I know that in astrology there is a doctrine on interrogations to know the name of the thief. That's very common, and you see it very common in sources. But for wars, I have never seen it applied that in the way you're saying, to...
Yes. For the interesting thing there is that one of those two scholars that I mentioned, Ibn Timur Bey, he copies a text or treatise on interrogational astrology by an earlier scholar, Ibn al-Farakhan al-Tabari, and he combines that with the horoscope for the Akoyunlu messenger. And elaborating, well, he actually uses the fragments from that other scholar, from At-Tabari, to appropriate it within his own views. So whereas the analysis of the names, for example, for thieves or in situations of war, in At-Tabari's work are not letterist at all. He sort of appropriates it within his own metaphysical framework. He does that with, for example, the interrogational work by At-Tabari on the one hand, but in another manuscript he also does that with the theory of Al-Ghalib wal-Maghlub, so the victor and the vanquished, that comes from the tradition of Sir al-Asrar, among others. So by looking at the names of the commanders in battle, he there sort of makes a prognostication of who will win, and he links that all those practices within this letterist framework. So it's very much appropriation of older texts.
Adapting to that specific circumstance where he's living. That's
yes, indeed.
Very interesting. And I must ask, are you planning to publish, or have you published your thesis?
I haven't published it yet, and I think I want to. I don't want to publish it as it is now, because it contains two different studies of two different collections, which was interesting for my dissertation. But I think if I want to publish it, it should become two different studies. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. Okay. And what are your future plans on research? Are you thinking of continuing this topic, deepen your knowledge, or?
Yes, I would really like to continue studying the second part of collections, the second collection of texts. I'm sorry. So the ones on Ilm Ahkam Nujum, so the astrology within the letterist framework, and I think that there are. I've found some new manuscripts already, but I think that there are a lot more. So I really want to dig into that, and get an idea of how that kind of astrology was practiced in this period and in the Sultanate of Cairo. And what I also find very interesting about these kind of texts that I want to research more or study more about is the fact that they are written or compiled really in the frontier zone of the Sultanate. So there's a lot of interaction, for example, with the Akoyunlu and other political entities there. So that's something that really intrigues me, because, well, there's research done on astrology in those situations, but a lot less on the Sultanate of Cairo. So I'm really interested in the links there, and the difference, of course, also.
And any kind of exchange happening at those border.
Yes.
So just for me to have an idea, because I'm not so versed in that particular period. So we're talking about the frontiers going up to Syria and all that region there.
Yes, in the text up till now, the places discussed are all in the Syrian Anatolian era. So, yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. My interest, my specific interest, and the Astro Project's main goal is to, of course, all of this is, it's valuable, extremely interesting for the history of astrology. All these contributions have been wonderful. Lately, yours and we're having a good discussion of the discipline. My focus has been in the project as well on the technical aspects. It will be interesting when you published, and you've already published part of this material, to really look at the not only the mathematical aspects, but the type of techniques of astrology they're using. Like, for example, you're mentioning that they're adapting certain techniques of orrery to other contexts of war. So they're creating a sort of a judgment that uses one model to apply to a different situation. And that's all very interesting, at least for me, for the project, to understand how these techniques are developed, and of course how they change through necessity as knowledge usually develops. You need to apply to a new situation, so you need to create something new. So I'm very interested in that, and also to understand how these are practiced. And I was thinking about our earlier conversation on the transmission, and I'm thinking at this same period, if we look at Portugal, which is the context I'm more familiar with, we do find this kind of transmission and learning in the Jewish communities. So we do have a very similar, because they're sort of a closed off, culturally closed off, from the rest. So they have their own learning systems, and you see a lot of this master to disciple transmission that you're observing as well, at more or less around the same period in Cairo. So it's quite interesting to see these parallels,
Yes, it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, and again, this copying of sources, this updating of sources they have. So it's quite interesting.
Yes, yeah. When it comes to the technicalities of the methods used, I'm also very interested in looking or studying a lot more of the sources by Ibn Timur Bey and Al-Hamzawi, the two scholars I mentioned, because now I have fragments of texts combined into these multiple texts, manuscripts, but not yet enough to really get an idea of the entire framework or method they're working with. So I have a lot of hypotheses about that, but it's still very much a work in progress, and that's something I would really like to work on more. I'm not really well versed in the mathematical side of things, so that's not really my focus. But I'm also interested in the combination or the overlap of the timekeepers methods and texts or calculations with the network of more occult scholars. So that are all things that I really that I'm still studying, and then I have a lot of questions and a lot of hypotheses about that, but that remains to be done for future research.
No, that's very interesting, and it's a very good project. And one last question, what I've noticed also in this period and earlier, there is a strong interest on the part of the Islamic world in terms of astrology into what we today call historical astrology. So explaining the long periods of the world through astrology, and the theory of conjunctions is going to play a big part on that. And since you mentioned this earlier with your timekeepers, that they had this noticing of conjunctions, have you seen any practice of that, or do you have evidences of that kind of thing?
No, actually, when I started my PhD research, I was very much looking for those kind of things. but I haven't, up until now, I haven't come across anything related to that. But I'm very, actually, I would really like to look at historiographical sources in future research, also to get an idea of the of where and how and why, for example, conjunctions could be mentioned or were mentioned in that respect, but I haven't come across it in the works of these scholars yet.
This specific group, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering, because yes, you do find, as you well know, astrology has several branches, several applications, and perhaps there's that one which is extremely interesting, the way they are counting the history of the world and through astrology. Perhaps it's perhaps a more academic version of astrology, while the examples you gave, they are practice, they're relating to things that are happening at the time. So they're more urgent in that regard, they're more out there. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and I think I don't know that for sure, but I would expect, for example, in historiographical sources to find things about that, because it's very much a theme that was popular in other areas in the same time. Like the millenarianism was very much something that people were writing about. So yeah, I'm curious to get an idea. Well, I really want to get an idea of if that was also the fact in sources from the Sultanate, but I can't really answer it yet.
Well, it's one of those things for the future. Hope for the future that you find the adequate documents and sources for it, and I hope you do. Yeah. I hope you do, because I think it's very interesting to see these local sources, these new data, these new practitioners. There's so many incognito material out there. And in the Islamic context, I think there's still so much to do. The archives are finally getting available. Digitalization has been a blessing, to have access to these materials, and I think there's still a lot of surprises out there.
I'm sure about that. There are so many manuscripts, even not cataloged yet. And the first time I went to, the one time that I went to the National Library in Cairo, I came with a list of manuscripts, and then I found like 3 times more when I was there. So if that is the case in a lot of similar libraries, there's a lot of research to be done still.
Yeah. And let me ask you a very practical question. Were these manuscripts easy to access? Once you were there, is it easy to digitize? Get that kind of access? How does that work?
It's possible, but it's not that easy. For example, when it comes to the National Library of Egypt, you can study certain categories, for example, the category of timekeeping, but then a lot of astrology texts are also in the category of letters and magic squares, it's called. And this is not accessible to the public. So that's something that is a bit difficult sometimes. And then, you can't make pictures yourself, so you have to order scans, but you can't order scans of the whole manuscript. So it's possible, but it takes some time and some
work.
Some work.
I understand.
So, but a lot of manuscripts, most of them from my collections are in Cairo, but some of them are also in European libraries, or in American libraries. But also there, the difficulty is mostly the categories. I mean, you can access all the categories in a European or an American library, but it's still sometimes a bit of guesswork to know if certain sources could be found in the religion category or in science or in magic. It's
the catalogs are not that. I think that can apply to Cairo and can apply to many libraries out there. You sometimes find things completely miscatalogue and have nothing to do with it.
Or they just, the cataloging system tells something about the interpretation in a certain period, but not really.
I found a lot of the catalogation in European libraries. Now it's changing and it's being updated, but have still that were made still when we had that early 20th century positivist attitude towards towards the history, history. So a lot of astrological things get classified under astronomy, calendars and timekeeping again. So and then you're looking at, oh, it's astronomy. Yeah, but it can be something else, and sometimes it's difficult to find.
Indeed.
That's just the challenges of an historian, especially one that's looking at such old sources. That's great.
It makes it interesting too. So.
It's like puzzle work, detective work. That's, I think that's the fun part.
Especially if you manage to find things.
And of course, in terms of your research path, you of course are versed in Arabic. You've learned Arabic. How do you that? Because I'm asking you this because to access these sources, we need to have the specialized knowledge required, and one of them, of course, is the language. And if you come from an Arabic background, the language is there with you from the beginning. But if you're not, you have to learn, and you have to have the whole process, the specific paleography of that period and of that language, etc. So how did that fit into your particular path in terms of schoolwork?
On the one hand, that was very much trial and error. So self-study and going to manuscript libraries and then finding new terms and having to study a bit more, those kind of things. But on the other hand, I also took a lot of courses in Arabic manuscript studies that really helped me. For example, one in Leiden, in the university library. That was a summer school that was very helpful and interesting. And also in the El Escorial library, very beautiful place, a very interesting course. So those kind of courses really helped me with at least the terminology for manuscript or manuscript studies in Arabic. And then when it comes to the astrological terminology, that was really mostly books and self-study and making mistakes and then having to correct what I was doing. And
because if we're interested in a specific thing, we do need to have that specific training for situations. I ask you this because it's interesting, and so I think it's also interesting for people who are listening to us, especially who are interested in this kind of research. What can they do if they are interested in studying Arabic manuscripts? What do they need to know, and how can they learn it?
It's a pity that there are no courses for studying Arabic astrology manuscripts yet. But different books and courses put together provided me with what I needed to know to do the research.
It is. Let's hope in the future, more courses and seminars can be arranged and can
indeed, that would
exist,
be
too.
Very nice.
perhaps you will do them yourself in the future. With your experience, you can teach others to do that kind of analysis. Okay, Fien. Thank you very much. It was a lovely conversation. It was great to know
Thank you.
you more and also your work. And I wish you the best of luck, in finding these
Thank you.
sources and getting to this new material. And I'm looking forward to your publications in the future, both your papers and your books eventually when you've done that, recollected that information. And thank you very much
Thank you very
here with
much. It
us.
was nice talking to you. Thank you for having me here.
It was a
And the
pleasure.
best of luck with the podcast.
And perhaps we'll see each other in a future podcast, to discuss further work that you've done.
Indeed, that would be very nice.
Okay.
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
See you later.